Okay, let's begin. Okay, thank you for coming to this second week of our workshop on scientific machine learning. Today, we will be covering operators and learning. Specifically, we'll be covering the topic of neural operators and how we can do operator learning. Okay, so for the aim of the lecture, we'll be giving a brief background overview of what neural networks are and how you can do deep learning using neural networks. Then we'll introduce the idea of neural operators and how you can do operator learning with it. We'll cover some of the similarities and differences between both approaches and how you can apply neural operators for some scientific machine learning applications. Okay, so let's go with it. So first off, you may ask what's a neural network is to begin with. Simply put, a neural network is just a function. It maps data points to target points per se. Often, the data is structured, and like these target points are finite. So one common example that you might be aware of about is in computer vision. You can use a neural network to classify images of like animals per se, and to assign each animal some kind of numerical animal ID. Like here, we have a picture of a cat, and we can say that corresponds to some identifier like number 5. And then there's some dog images, and we can classify that as some identifiers like number 1. But this is just the general gist of a neural network. And more importantly, we should understand like why do these neural networks even work, and like how can we use neural networks to classify images like shown here, and how does the neural network actually do this in practice? Make sense? Okay. So the theory of neural networks is long and rich history. It goes back a couple of decades to like the 90s. It's a bit more mathematical than people realize it to be. So bear with me for the next few moments. So how are we so sure that neural networks behave like functions? And why should we believe that they even behave like functions to begin with? Well, there's some deep mathematical theory behind neural networks. This is the so-called theory of universal approximation theory. And these mathematical theories ensure us that these neural networks behave more so like mathematical objects than like so-called like artificial brain neurons. And in practice, mathematics is still easier to understand than even biology to this day. So this is one kind of this theory from this universal approximation theory. It's a bit long and complicated, but I'll help you guys digest it. Okay, so what does this even big, long, convoluted formulation of a theory even say? So this theory basically claims that a neural network can take an input of data points, then it can compose itself with some linear and nonlinear functions. So we try to just look at the statement. We have some kind of reference function that we want to model here. And we just assume some technical mathematics stuff. And then it says that using a neural network, we can parameterize it with some kind of input width with a vector, some kind of depth, and some kind of width. And this will behave pretty much like a function. So a bit more explicitly, this after you have your inputs, your data inputs, you can just compose it with some linear and so-called nonlinear functions. You keep on doing this repeatedly, possibly an infinite number of times. And in the end, the math just works out and it says it can represent basically any kind of function. Okay, that's great and all, but how do we use these ideas in practice? What kind of like nonlinear or so-called activation functions do we even use? Also, how deep do we even go when we do these neural networks? Because at the end of the day, we are going to code up these neural networks on computers, and computers only have a limited amount of memory and compute power to them. So the basic idea behind, well, the main inspiration behind neural networks come from biological neural networks that you find in your own brains. Here, we see a picture of a neuron inside of the brain, and it's connected to other neurons via so-called like synapses or kind of axons. And basically, these neurons can kind of help perceive like vision or pain or any kind of feelings. It kind of receives the data perception via some kind of chemical reaction. Then it kind of combines all these signals together into the cell bodies here. And then these signals are transformed and amplified via the membrane sheet into other areas of the brain. Now, the details behind this biological model is very complicated. It's only been kind of uncovered in the last 100 years or so. But in the end, we can kind of simplify this biological model into a more artificial model, the so-called artificial neural networks, which is something like you see here. The picture on the right is an encapsulation of a multilayer perceptron. It's one of the earliest models of an artificial neural network. And it relies on this idea of like hidden layers to do computations. So basically, you have this input layer. This can kind of perceive like the so-called like pain or pleasure receptors. And then it feeds itself into these hidden layers. And inside these hidden layers is where you do the bulk of these computations. So in these hidden layers are kind of reminiscent of this axon trunk you see here. And inside here, this is where all the like signal amplification and degradation goes on. So let's study what goes on there a bit more. So a bit more of a overview is that these hidden layers basically are composed with itself some kind of like, it takes some kind of inputs like X, then you have these so-called weight W. And then for each of the inputs, you multiply against some weight to itself and add it to so-called some kind of bias term. What this effectively does, it just takes a linear amplification of the signal input. But we learned earlier here that this kind of theory requires some nonlinear functions to follow it. And this is kind of also been noticed in like biology as well. Whenever you see like EKG data from like people's heart or even brains, you see spikes from like their movements and kind of signals. So we do need these kind of nonlinearities here. But furthermore is that these hidden layers are basically basically hidden, where there's not too much well understood theory as to how wide or how deep these hidden layers should go. And sometimes there's might be some strange behaviors towards their practice. To be honest, most practitioners just go with the idea is deeper is just better, or wider is just better. So this is why we kind of see these like huge neural networks we see today, like ChatGPT, and their so-called 100 billion parameters. Now, technically, these modern neural networks aren't too big in comparison. The human brain is only a couple of trillion of neurons, but considering the fact that these artificial neurons are more energy inefficient, there's still a long ways to go towards developing good artificial neural networks. Now, these choice of activation functions also play a crucial role, but they're usually there's usually two main choices behind them. These are the so-called rectified linear unit on the left, which is basically a piecewise linear function, and also the hyperbolic tangent function. These two functions are kind of like the main choices because they're pretty easy to compute on a computer, and there are some pretty clever formulas you can do with them, and to make their computations pretty simple in the end. Now, these hidden, yes. No, it's just a single function. These are like the same function in N. Yes, so for like each layer, these could be all the same activation function applied to it after the linear layers here. And then sometimes, often that it's just the same activation function, the whole neural network. Like if you decide to use like a hyperbolic tangent function in your neural network, it's going to be the same throughout. Yes, in all the layers. Okay. So, any other questions? Yes. It's so the reason why these are called hidden layers is because they also have these hidden parameters like the bias and the weights. These are just introduced here because this is kind of like comes out of like the kind of like the models behind the brain, because and also because of this universal approximation theory. So if there's a linear part, there should be linear parameters to them. So if you remember like the equation for a line, there's a slope term, which is kind of like your W, and then you have your offset term, which is kind of like your bias here. So this is just due to the linear behaviors of neural networks. Now, because we introduce these hidden parameters, we kind of have to determine their value so that we can compute with them. And this determination has been a long history and has caused a bit of headache in its initial beginnings. So, yeah. So how do we learn these W's or these weights and biases respectively? So what we can do is we can basically do some optimization theory. So the main behind idea is that we want our neural network to represent our outputs in N. So if we believe that this is the case, we can kind of impose it so that the difference between the neural network outputs and the true outputs are basically near zero. Or in other words, like the square of their values are almost to zero. So what we can do is we can kind of minimize the difference between the squared differences and try to produce the parameters like these W's and betas to minimize the loss or difference between the predictions and the true values that we have from the data set. Does that make sense so far? Any questions? Okay. Moving on. In general, computing this minimum is pretty difficult, and there's no simple formula behind its value. So what we can do instead is we can do something called gradient descent. Basically, since we have that the neural networks are made from linear and nonlinear functions that we impose onto it on the computer, we can calculate the derivatives of the neural network. And using the derivatives of the neural network, we can find its minimum value. And so the best fitting parameters to the neural network. Sounds good. Any questions? The delta? Yes, this term is technically what people call the loss function here. Yeah. This is basically what's inside this minimization term. We're trying to minimize kind of loss function or cost function. This is some kind of special derivatives. Yeah. So yeah. Let's see. Now, a problem with this approach is that we have to compute these derivatives or these delta, the loss values against these parameters. This is what caused the main like struggles in the early histories of artificial intelligence in like the 60s, because computing these derivatives is a big pain by hand. And so back in the day, people had to like kind of hard code this onto like computers, and that was a bit cumbersome. But now we have some special software like machine learning libraries that can do this for us. For example, PyTorch and like TensorFlow all support this idea called backpropagation. Basically, what backpropagation allows us to do is basically compute these derivatives for us. And in fact, it does this automatically once we state what neural network we're using. So more details about like this coding and like the use of these like frameworks are going to be in like the tutorial at the end of the month. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, but one of the problems with like this approach of using these multi-layer perceptrons is that we can see like for each of these arrows, there's some kind of weight associated towards each of them. And this kind of accumulates itself in the end. So if we try to calculate how many parameters there are in like a simple like multilayer perceptron, there's gonna be quite a few. Like for just this, like a image of a dog, which is 100 by 100, there's gonna be like about over 1 million parameters to store for just like this single layer of a neural network. So yeah. No, each line is associated to a specific weight. So each line is kind of like how much importance this like neuron or input is to the rest of the network.
So like what are the activations?
They're the kind of the main like processing unit behind your neural networks, because if you don't have these activation functions, this theory completely breaks down. It's no longer valid. You can't represent any kind of function with a neural network anymore. So these activations are really important in the end. So that's why they always follows a linear function. So yeah, we went back. So yeah. Yeah. Now, another problem with these multi-layer perceptrons is that they're not really well suited towards handling images. They're only suited towards handling like vectors. So we basically kind of have to like take this 2D grid of pixels and flatten it to like a one-dimensional vector instead. And this basically kind of loses a bunch of information from the image. Because if you basically cut up an image into slices and stitch them together, you wouldn't recognize this as a dog in the end. And then lastly, once you have like this kind of vector, there's also some more loss of information going on. Because if you kind of like rotate the dog, it would still remain a dog, but then having like this just straight up list of numbers, you can't really kind of rotate it anymore. So you basically lose like some kind of ability to interpret your inputs in the end. So because of these three issues, people have kind of borrowed ideas from other areas of like computer science, and specifically more so like from computer vision, where they have this idea of convolution, which works really well with image data. So to make better use of the fact that images are like a grid of numbers, they do this special operation called a convolution, which is kind of what is pictured here. Basically, you have your grid of numbers or pixel values for an image here, and you have this kind of special weight matrix or convolution. And what it does, it basically kind of does a average of your pixel values from here. So here we see that the stored weight for this convolution is like 404 along the diagonal. So it just basically averages out everything here. So like here, we basically multiply everything element-wise. So majority of the values are 0. But we see like this, the only thing that once we multiply towards the end that's non-zero is this last entry here with 2 and -4. So that means that the value after the convolution is going to be -8. And in the end, you keep on applying this convolution towards this the inner part of the image. So you keep on moving the square along the image and just keep on applying the convolution over and over again. So basically, in the end, these kind of convolutions does some kind of local averaging of neighboring pixel values against some weights matrix here. So a bit other view of this is that the reason why this is pretty useful for computer vision is that they preserve the spatial behaviors of images and basically keeps a chunk of it towards the end. So like here, we kind of see like in the picture of a dog, the convolution takes like these 4 pixel values and squeezes it towards this single value. And it keeps on going to and applying the process over and over towards each 4 pixel neighboring values. This process is pretty memory efficient because it just depends on like the size of how big your convolution matrix is. Usually these sizes are pretty small, like a 3x3 size is pretty common, and it's really memory efficient in the end. Now, any questions with convolutions? Yeah.
So this is just like a book.
It kind of is, but it's a bit more high dimensional per se. Your multiplication behaves a bit differently. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Go back. Like go back to from a dog. Usually, you're gonna need some other techniques to go back to a dog besides just convolutions. You have to use some other ideas like so-called like embeddings, which kind of basically enlarge your images or shrinks these images as well. Yeah. 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 No, they keep the same convolution weights for the whole image, for the whole input. This is what makes it so memory efficient in the end, because for every input, it just only needs to apply the small set of weights each time. Now, technically, you can have multiple layers of convolutions. Here, there's like technically like 3 layers of convolutions with this convolution symbol here. You do convolution once, and then you do your nonlinear activation function, then do convolution again, and the nonlinear activation function, and then like so on and so on again. You do this like 3 times, or like this like depth 3 CNN here. And in the end, people kind of use like these convolutional neural networks to predict like the classes for images. Like it's pretty easy to train a CNN to kind of like predict that this image is a dog or cat. And this is kind of like the main like backbone behind like neural networks for like the previous like 15 years ago. Like 15 years, like, okay, 13 years ago, I believe like Hinton and like Ilya Sutskever, another PhD student, released a convolutional neural network called AlexNet that could classify images really well. And that's how this it basically started the first revolution in deep learning here at U of T as well. So, and these convolutions are still being used towards these days in like modern computer vision tasks due to their like efficiency. And these make it very applicable to use like in smartphones, because you don't want your models to get like billions in size, because otherwise it won't be able to fit on your smartphone and it will take too much energy to use as well. Any other questions? So another benefit of using convolutions is that they preserve like the spatial information in these images. So for example, if you scale these picture of a cat, you can see that after you apply the convolution, the scaled inputs still behave as you expect it will before, after the convolution as well. So if you scale first and then apply convolution, it's the same thing as applying a convolution first and then scaling that convolved images. So this is what we mean by preserving the spatial information. And so this is pretty useful in towards the end, because like once you scale, if you have like a high resolution image of a cat, apply the convolution towards it, you'll still have your neural network prediction remaining the same as before, which is a nice property to have. Though I should say that usually when you train these convolutional neural networks, you have to basically set the size of images you're going to be working with beforehand. Like once you train these CNNs on like say a set of images on like 100 by 100, if you want to input like a different kind of image, like a different size, like 200 by 200, you can't do that really easily per se. You have to like downsample and throw away most of your pixel values in N. So, but you can do some other techniques to kind of avoid this. And this is going to be in the follow-up section of this talk. And for some other symmetries that are useful, is like these translation symmetries, where you move like these objects and images around, you'll still keep the behavior like this in the end. Same thing if you want to rotate your images as well. And because of these special symmetries and with the convolution operation, there's some very interesting patterns you can observe once you train these convolutional neural networks. For example, if you want to classify images using a CNN, and if you look at the weights of these convolution matrices, you can see that as you go deeper into your CNN, each layer learns some specific level of detail behind your data. So in the first layer, what you can kind of maybe guess from like these images is that it kind of detects like the edges of human faces. And then in the second layer, you start to see more facial structure. Like, for example, you can see some things that look like eyes, other things that looks like nose. This one looks like an ear. And then in the third layer, you can see actual faces being shown and kind of basically learned in these weights of the neural network. Any questions?
It's the same layer.
No, these are different layers. Like these is like the first layer, and then as deeper as you go, the more kind of information or high fidelity signals the neural networks are able to pick up. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Um, so if you use like this convolutions instead of like these fully connected like multi-layer perceptrons, you find that your performance is much higher than what you're capable of. And you can see like the depth also plays a big role, because even if you keep it on the same depth, you're more parameter efficient, but your like quality is still technically the same. So if you want to improve your classification quality, you have to go deeper with your networks. So instead of like 3 layers, you go through like 11 layers, and this would basically increase the performance in N. Now, even though like the the depths are fixed in each tree of these networks, the width and the size of these like kernels and convolutions can also be different. So this is why you can see like the number of parameters is different for even the neural networks of the same depth and same kind of design. Any other questions? So yeah, here we see like these two networks that are like the same depth technically perform about the same. But if you want to improve the performance, you have to go deeper, which is what you can see with the red and blue lines. Yes? You, you do like the same gradient descent in the end. Basically, like um, you don't really have to worry too much on how they're determined, because as long as you code up like the same kind of like frameworks like here, determining the values are pretty simple, and then it's like a 3-liner basically. Yeah, it's no longer a headache like a couple of decades before. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Um, okay, so basically of at the end of the background check. So basically what we covered so far is like the theory behind like neural networks, and how we can use like the um inherent behavior like image data to kind of design the kind of neural network we can use in the end. So like the kind of choice between like these multi-layer perceptrons or convolutions, and also how we can train our neural networks and using like gradient descent and back propagations. And using these convolutional neural networks, we can kind of like detect like these facial features in the end that aren't so easy to be picked up by a conventional means. So, but so far we only covered like image data. Are there any kind of other applications towards like more other use cases like in science? And that's going to be kind of like the basis of the next half of this talk. But before we go there, let's take a bit of a break for now, okay? Okay. Okay, so let's get back to it. Where are we? Okay, neural operators and operator learning. So basically, um, the main behind the main ideas behind like neural networks and deep learning transfer themselves pretty well over to some more complicated settings. You basically kind of do like the same thing, but with a different kind of objects instead of like functions instead, which is so-called ideas of operators. But before I get into the ideas of what operators are, I need to talk first a bit more about like data. So basically, in it's not just about like text and images in science. There's a whole host of different kinds of data in different fields. For example, we have like cell membranes and tissue fibers. This constitutes itself as like kind of like a map basically of like your skin. We're at like different heights on top of the skin is like kind of a different kind of um, cellular body. And then with proteins, this kind of data is a bit more similar to text sequences because you can encode these protein structures as like a sequence of amino acids, but different to text sequences. Like the order of the sequence doesn't really matter. There's no like left to right for like these amino acids. Likewise, for like um, the shapes of like these cars and airplanes, they can have some special quantities related to it, like the force applied to the wings due to like turbulence. Also, there could be some drag on this car, for example, and and basically in each of these scenarios, these are kind of more conceptually different than like the text and images that we're used to. And how we can model these kinds of phenomenons is that we can kind of just consider like all of these kinds of different kind of data modalities as a function per se. Like we can for like these proteins, we can consider this as like a kind of a discrete function that maps like the some kind of like um anemo some kind of sequence towards a specific like amino acid. And for like this tissue, we can kind of have like a function that kind of maps out like the different values it can take on different heights and levels, as well as like the different kinds of permeability and kind of thickness of the skin as well. Likewise, for like the geology of these rocks, we can kind of consider this as like a 3D function in space that kind of represents like the density of the rock that's currently at that position. And we can also have like a bit more dynamic data, like weather data. That's a function of like space and time that can represent like the pressure or temperature at that particular point and instance in time. Now that we have like these kinds of data, we can how are we going to model the data that we have for like each of these different scenarios? Well, there's this general tool that we can use for mathematics called differential equations. And we can use like these differential equations to model the data for each of these kind of scenarios. Maybe not too much for like these proteins, but they still follow some kind of governing equation, but that's a bit getting out of scope. Our presenter will be talking more about that in the next 2 weeks. Okay, so basically, differential equations are basically everywhere in science. For example, I only present like four of like the biggest ones here. So for like this first one is what you call like the Schrodinger equation. This differential equation is pretty relevant towards computational chemistry. And basically using this equation, you can basically predict any kind of like chemical reaction in the end. After that, we have like the Einstein field equations, which kind of models how the universe behaves at the galactic scales, and also provides a good model of towards gravity and black holes at those scales as well. For like more like weather or weather forecasting, we have like the so-called Navier-Stokes equations, which models how fluids flow in a frictionless medium. And now studying all these kinds of differential equations is very difficult in the end. Like for this Navier-Stokes equation, there's a prize of $1 million if you can say whether or not that the solutions towards this equation is stable in some kind of mathematical sense. And even then, even though we can't solve these equations traditionally, we can still solve them numerically. However, when we try to solve these equations numerically, they're often extremely expensive to do so, and we have to employ some very huge and large supercomputers towards them. For example, weather predictions usually done on these like supercomputers, like the number 5, the 5th most powerful supercomputer in the world in like Switzerland. It's solely dedicated towards predicting the weather in Europe all the time. And for like one last scenario, there's these so-called like reaction diffusion equations. And using this equation, you can model like the pattern formation in like animals. Like you can see these fancy exotic dots on this fish. And you can also model the stripes on the zebra as well. And this is a pretty interesting phenomenon. The surprising thing is that this wasn't suggested or first noticed by a mathematician. It was actually noticed by a computer scientist called Alan Turing. And so these behaviors can arise from very complicated mathematical phenomena, which makes them also difficult to solve in the end. So now, how should we approach these differential equations? Because these differential equations kind of like govern how the data behaves towards an end. Because for this example with the airplane, since it's flying through the skies, it has to obey like the Navier-Stokes equations. And so once you apply some kind of like thrust to the plane, the equation will tell you how fast you can go in the end. And so basically, if you know how fast you're going currently and you push your accelerator to the max, you want to know what's the fastest you can go in the end in the plane. So how are you going to predict that out in the end? Can you kind of like use a neural network to predict how fast you're going to go? Well, there's something kind of like that. We can kind of use like our current ideas from like neural networks and deep learning towards a similar extents. But instead of using like functions, we kind of have to use something a bit more complicated called a operator, which is kind of behaves similar towards a function. But instead of working on just like points or vectors, you can apply these operators on functions itself directly, like other functions, like the shape of the airplane, or like the global values of the weather, like all the temperature values across the entire globe at once. And this is the main framework towards like scientific machine learning people do towards this day. So a bit more detail about that is that these neural operators or behave just like neural networks, but they work on function data instead. So for example, you can take like some temperature field here and kind of output like the resulting temperature field after like 1 hour in time, or after you kind of cook it in the oven with some other, like say, chemicals. And this kind of like behaves some kind of differential equations. Like for example, you can stir these two different like fluids or metals, and after like 1 minute, this could be what it looks like after 1 minute of stirring. And then there's some other more interesting operators you can kind of think about. For like example, like last week, I talked about weather prediction and like this forecast net model. This forecast net model is actually an example of a neural operator. And basically what it does, it takes the current weather pattern, like it takes information about all the current temperature values, the pressure values across the whole world. And using that value, it kind of tries to evolve the weather forward in time by like say an hour or a day, and gives you like the prediction at that point in time. And because we know that these like the weather patterns like obeys like this kind of differential equations, we can we can we can be sure that it's well behaved per se. But so a bit more details about that is that generally like these inputs towards these operators are called like the data is kind of can be like the initial conditions, or like these like the parameters of a animal. For example, we can measure like the length of this fish, for example, and what kind of species it is, and we can input that into the operator to kind of figure out like the patterns and formations that will take on. And then also we can kind of predict like some kind of solutions towards like these differential equations in the end, as another approach that we can use to solve like these forward and inverse problems that I talked about in last time as well. So a bit more about the process. Yeah. They're a bit more implicit, because it's kind of like it's just a model of your data. So like in computer vision, you know that your images are basically a 2D grid of pixel values. But for other applications like in sciences, like you have different kinds of data that can be modeled more by functions. And these functions are themselves follow their own models given by these differential equations. Now, you don't have to model these differential equations exactly, but just knowing the fact that they're obeying some kind of like equation is still a useful fact. Like how we kind of use the fact that these images are like a 2D array of pixel values. Now, if you want to go use the idea that that your data is following this kind of equation, you can impose like the behavior of these equations directly onto your data, into your neural networks. And this is kind of like the main topic of next week's lecture. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, okay. Basically, just to recall, these neural operators, like I said, they basically take some input function and basically outputs another function out in the end. And they're pretty flexible as well. I talked about how, like, with convolutional neural networks, they're a bit rigid because, like, if you train it on a fixed, you have to train on a single resolution, like 100 by 100 images, and then it can only produce a single classification in N. But if you want to classify like bigger images, then you basically have to redo the whole thing from scratch. Now, these neural operators have a different approach. It's because that since they're modeling these kinds of data a bit more implicitly, they're a bit more flexible towards that. Like, for example, here you can have your data be in more come in from a bit more finer quality, higher quality, and you can also output at a higher quality as well. So, like, if you give it an input with like 100 points, it can give you also an output with 100 points, even though you trained it on data that only have like 20 points in them that can represent your functions. Now, a bit more of how you can like build these neural operators. It's basically kind of like the same way as you would have a neural network. So, like, basically the whole general gist of neural networks is you have your input vector X, then you apply a linear function to it, then you put your nonlinear activation function, and then you keep on doing this until you basically get something that works in N. And then you basically have like the same idea with neural operators. You have something called like a linear operator, and then you apply the same nonlinearity as before. Like, these can be same, like rectified units or like the hyperbolic tangent nonlinearities. But the only main difference is like how you do like your linear functions, because instead of using functions, you're using an operator per se. Does that make sense so far? Okay, a bit more about the detail is like a bit more explicit details is like, is there an operator version of this convolution I was talking about? Because we saw how useful it was with like images per se. And technically, most of the scientific data is still stored kind of like images, but they're a bit more variable. Like, they come on all kinds of different resolutions in N. And so having something that can accept like different like kind of qualities or resolutions and still be workable and flexible towards that is pretty useful. So let's take a look into this. Basically, what you can like substitute instead of convolution is you can have something called a Fourier operation instead of a convolution. So the details of this Fourier operation instead of convolution is a bit technical. You'll learn it more in like a fourth year math class. But basically, the gist is that this is pretty similar towards a convolution. And it also has some other benefits as well. For example, it's there's a fast hardware implementations of this Fourier operations on CPUs and GPUs. A bit more interestingly is that it kind of also preserves the quality as its inputs, because if you go back all the way towards the convolution example, you may notice like as you go deeper with inside the network, the quality of your images degrades as well. This is a bit problematic because if you keep on trying to get like deeper networks, at some point there's a trade-off because there's diminishing returns. But this is just kind of due to this local averaging of the convolution operation. If this convolution was a bit more global, like if this convolution was the same size as your source image, then you can preserve like the quality of your inputs throughout the neural network. And this is kind of what the Fourier operator kind of does. And another final comment about the neural operator is that it also helps out with our models of science because it kind of makes like these complicated derivatives here and then actually like simple and basically kind of like make it a kind of like linear operation now. Because technically when you take derivatives, you can have like completely other different kind of functions. But when you apply like the Fourier operator towards like the derivatives, it's kind of like doing like addition and multiplication towards the end. So this makes it pretty similar towards like linear functions, kind of per se. This is why it's kind of like considered as a linear operator. Again, the details about those 3 points are a bit technical, so I can comment about them if you guys want. Are there any other? Do you guys have any questions about it? So, because of these benefits, the Fourier neural operators have seen the most widespread use in like scientific machine learning. You can kind of think about this as being as useful as convolutions are in image processing. Because of these approaches, it has the same kind of design as a neural operator. I would say like, though there's technically the nonlinearity inside of these layers, so that's a small issue with the image, but basically, yeah.
Show us a Fourier layer would look like.
I think I have a picture of that. Let me see. Let me see. I think I forgot to include about. I can show it to you later. Okay. So, but yeah. Yeah, it's a technical mathematical detail, but it basically kind of preserves quality in the end. And this is due to some kind of fancy mathematical theory you'll learn in like an engineering class or in like a math class in like 3rd or 4th year. So I don't want to get too much into the details. Even though it's what? Kind of, yeah. There's some kind of different things that goes on, but yeah. So, okay. So, okay, we have like this kind of basically have the main design for our neural operator out. We can learn like the weights towards these Fourier layers in the same way as we did with neural networks, where we just do back propagation and learn the values of the parameters. And because we're doing it on operators instead, people call this operator learning. So, let's get it. Yeah.
So in this case, will we apply a activation function on the Fourier layers?
Yeah, they are. They're hitting in the picture, and I just forgot to.
Activation function.
No, they're the same one. There's like they're literally, yeah, they're like literally the same thing as this.
We could all use like
Yeah. It's pretty much everything similar. It's just kind of just substituting individual things out in the end. So yeah. And okay, as for a bit more applications for this, last week we basically kind of saw an example of a neural operator. So we saw ForecastNet last week, which basically does weather prediction. It's an example of a Fourier neural operator, and has some, because of the special properties I mentioned, like its fast hardware implementation, it's able to beat conventional numerical solvers by a couple orders of magnitude, while still being like much easier to use in practice. Like this is being compared against like the supercomputer I mentioned last time, and as this is also able to handle loads of data as well, like 10 terabytes of data as well, weather data. This is due to the fact that weather data span like last 60 years or so, and there's many weather stations across the world. Additionally, because like the conventional methods are so costly, you can only make one prediction at a time. And from this predictions, people will generally make all sorts of decisions from it, like policy decisions, evacuation orders, or stay-in-place orders. But if you want to bet like your policies on a single data point, this is often not the best idea. So due to the efficiency of these of the Fourier FNO approach towards ForecastNet, you're able to predict 1,000 predictions in just a few seconds. This kind of gives you a more informed picture of how like these weather events will behave towards the end, and drives up better policy decisions as well. Yeah.
What is the accuracy of this?
This is basically the same as conventional methods.
Also, it's pretty.
Yeah. For a new example, there's this idea called carbon capture and storage, which kind of believes that you can take CO2 from like power stations or like concrete production and kind of concentrate it and send it towards like the underground, so that it's stored underground and doesn't get released in the atmosphere. This is a pretty important approach towards the fight against climate change, and especially net zero, because things like concrete production produces like a significant proportion of CO2 in the year, like about 10% of global emissions. And usually there's no other way to avoid concrete production, because we have to keep on like building new houses and stuff like that. So, but this presents like some of the only solutions towards some of the global emissions problems. You basically, what you do is you kind of like take like your CO2 emissions from like the factory, and you kind of pump it down underground. Now, the problem with this is that this will affect like the geology on beneath you, like the rock structures, and can be potentially unstable towards the end. So basically, you want to predict like whether the grounds surrounding the pipes are going to be stable in like even like 50 or 100 years, because you want to keep on like pumping CO2 down there for the like foreseeable decades. And so this is an incredibly difficult challenge. My friend personally did summer research on this project, and it was, the main difficulty behind it is that even if you try to design like the kind of best machine learning approach to allocate like your pumping stations as well, you'll find that even if you try to figure out like whether your idea is optimal or not, you have to simulate the behavior 20, 30, or 50 years down the line. This long-term simulation is very expensive. And it's so expensive, in fact, that my friend had to go petition to Canada's supercomputers to borrow one of their computers to simulate it. And that was a whole hassle towards itself. Now, yeah.
So for this one and before Castaneda as well.
Yeah.
What is it like? What was the training time for the entire?
Don't worry, I'll get there. There's training time details here. So for this example, this one was trained for about like a couple hours on like a single GPU or like 8 GPUs, I believe. And then once you try to do the prediction after training, it only takes you a couple milliseconds in the end. For comparison, if you were to simulate on a supercomputer, it would take you a couple days. This leads to a factor of speed of about 700,000 in the end. And basically, the reason why this is so difficult is because you have to kind of like solve a differential equation like everywhere in this big medium and towards like many years in the future. And then you have to do many different scenarios, like different hole placements as well. So this helps the carbon capture storage because the simulation and stabilities of these plants to these piping and digging plants are like the main concern when you try to do this in practice. That's why there's only about like 40 carbon capture sites in the whole world. And they only like so far are able to extract like 40 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, I believe, or metric tons. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Quantum computers are not, I don't think they will work towards this because they're trying to solve like differential equations towards differential equations, and like the amount of data that you represent, like you have to store like the information about like the entire rock formation like deep underground, and then doing computation with that is also a bit of headache as well. This is why you also need like sometimes like thousands of like CPUs usually do this traditional. Okay, yes. Yeah. Well, the thing is with these traditional approaches is that you have to kind of like do it on a whole grid. So you basically kind of have to do it everywhere, but you're kind of concerned about like mainly around the pipes areas, which are small, which is just a small fraction of your land mass. You can technically focus your computation, your traditional computation towards that in the end, but it's still a challenging problem, and it's still not the best approach towards it. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, for one last application in like the auto industry, when you're designing your cars, you want to kind of find out if like your designs are going to be like aerodynamic, and try to figure out how much drag there's going to be in your vehicle. This is partly due to the fact that also that there's like government subsidies and regulation behind these designs as well. So having aerodynamic design is pretty good. You can also use it for like F1 racing situations as well. So the main problem behind this approach is that this is kind of like a fluid problem interacting with very complicated and fine detailed geometries like this car here. For example, like this, like the whole mesh for this car could be like a couple 100 gigabytes or maybe terabytes in size. And trying to like solve this traditionally is going to be a bit costly. For example, here we have like a traditional method like called open foam, which simulates the aerodynamic drags in the car. And even though open foam uses like parallel GPUs, it's still not able to have like the same time and performance trade-off with like these neural operators. This here, we have a different kind of neural operator that uses more information about the geometry of the problem and of the data. But we can see here that even the FNO still performs pretty well in the end. And notably, the speed up is very significant still, on the order of like 140,000. So instead of like trying to figure out like where the drag is worst at the whole car, and like takes like instead of a day to figure out like the drag simulation, it can take a couple of minutes or seconds in the end. Any other questions? Yes.
So after you train this neural network, let's say you make a really small change in the design of the car, right?
Yes.
Is this neural network trained for like an entire space of possible car geometries, or is it trained for this very specific car geometry?
Yes and no. For like simple implementation, it's trained for specific cars, but you can adapt it to accept a whole range and families of cars, like with different like models, different sizes. This is still like an ongoing area of research. And in fact, you can also do some other techniques, like you can also retrain a little bit after you do a slight modification and still be able to have comparable performances before.
So let's say we have already trained a network and then we do a retraining based on the.
You only retrain it for a small fraction, like 1% about.
Yeah. We do that.
Yeah.
So this entire training time.
Yeah.
And let's consider the accuracy as well.
Yeah.
How would this compare to a CFD model?
CFD. So the main thing with that's kind of complicates like the use in N is like the data to use to train these neural operators. Since it's for like this auto example, since the car is new, you basically have to kind of do some initial like
CFD models.
Yes, but you don't have to go to the full scale resolution towards the simulation. So you can simulate at a lower quality and still be able to maintain these high quality predictions with your neural operators. That's what makes neural operators so powerful.
So let's say in the end we do the entire training, right?
Yeah.
What? Because the order like is one of the.
Yeah.
You've listed a couple of models, right?
Yeah.
None of those are, I presume, are CFD models, right?
No.
So
these are
what
deep learning.
would be a test error for a CFD model?
Because
it has to be like
here's like kind of one, like this OpenFOAM is a traditional CFD model. This is accuracy on the left versus total time. Now, as for like data, because like if you don't have data that's collected or recorded, you will have to simulate it for training. And for like training, you can see it's a bit more expensive, but it's not as bad as full-on simulation. For example, here, we can see like the training cost is still less than simulation, like by one order of magnitude. And I would like to notice like the quantities as well. This is one sample, and this is a so-called epoch, which has tens of thousands of samples in it as well. This is due to the fact that we kind of like train at a lower quality and kind of upgrade to higher quality later on in inference. Yes? Yes, there are towards like more simpler like geometry, like for very high detail geometries like a car. This is where they struggle the most. This is why like Boeing spends like $1 billion towards like air wing simulations and optimizations. But for more simpler and small scale problems, it's not as bad with traditional methods. Yeah. It's just to group data together. Like you have like 10,000 different scenarios, like 10,000 different well configurations or like locations on Earth that you can drill into. And it's just basically more data. Like instead of like a picture of one cat, you have 10,000 pictures of a cat to learn from. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I think that's it for today. Next week, we'll be covering physics-informed machine learning and physics-informed neural networks. Okay? All right. Yeah. Yeah. Simulations. When you're doing simulations, you can only do it for like one sample at a time. But due to the fact like these machine learning methods are often parallelizable, people like to do multiple samples at a time. And so instead of talking about samples during training, people talk about epochs during training, because you can train data in parallel on GPUs. Yeah. And yeah, there's also yeah, also I know I said this to you guys last time, but please fill out like this availability form. Our guest speakers are like 4 hours ahead of us, so this would help out with planning a lot. Okay. With that, let's end the Zoom meeting. Yeah.
So are the next meetings going to be fully online?
They can be online or in person. I've already booked out the room. Depends on whatever you guys want. But the guest speakers are going to be online, yes. Next week is going to be same room, same time. Okay. All right.